without further ado, who wants to say just a short prayer before we start? Anyone? Something is Is anybody willing to say prayer, or should I say prayer myself? No, I will just say prayer myself because nobody is ready. And I'm going to say one that the Utterance Project has been teaching us, and I have, of course, known when I was a kid, which is the removal of difficulties so that God can remove all the difficulties.
Mr. Zein,
Yes.
Could you please say prayer in Arabic? I love to listen to Arabic being spoken and chanted.
My Arabic. You know, you're talking to an Egyptian that lived only 5 years in Egypt.
Oh,
the
really?
rest of the time, I lived in Western countries,
Okay.
Morocco, Spanish speaking, French speaking, American speaking. So I lost, but I still have my Arabic accent, just as I still have my real Spanish accent because I picked up when I was young. But I cannot carry a conversation, or I may if I try hard. So I would just say the prayer, chant it, but it's probably Arabic sounding.
You know, none of us would know the difference.
من مفرج غير الله قل سبحان الله هو الله كل عباد له وكل بأمره قائمون. I hope God forgives me because that chanting is so bad. But you know, I guess I said the right words. So the Bob must be happy because I said the words. I know, no choice. You can't always have the nice voices you hear on the internet. All right.
Thank you.
That was nice.
Thank you, Sariba. Thank you.
You're also going to say a closing prayer.
Sorry?
You're also going to say a closing prayer.
Who?
You.
Oh my God.
I have to fix this, Dad. Hold on. I'll only see your forehead.
No, I have to hold it. I'm going to hold like this, like this book. I have to find ways of holding this. Don't worry. So,
better if it's not on the books.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Maybe the books is no good.
The books is no good.
Right. We made a mistake with these books. We tried to raise this thing. Now, I'm going to go back for a second, if you don't mind, because that was Abdu'l-Bahá when he was visiting the Bowery in New York. You all heard that, but I want to listen to it again because the 300 people that were there that Abdu'l-Bahá spoke to, and he gave them this silver coins, whatever those were, the 25-cent coins, I guess. There was a footnote. I think I read the footnote, but just to refresh your mind for she wrote that, I don't know when, you know, after she wrote the book, I guess. She said, months later, John Good told me about Hannigan. So Hannigan was a generous man. If he had a dime and somebody needed a nickel, he would split the dime. But there was no doubt about it, he was also a Bowery tough and pretty nearly always drunk. He had been counting the days to the 19th of April. That's when Abdu'l-Bahá was supposed to speak at the Bowery. But unluckily, lost count. And when the 19th came, and with it, the master's visit to the Bowery, he was in one of his stupors. Waking up from it, he really sorrowed. Still, there was another chance. The master was to speak in Flatbush the following Sunday, and somehow Hannigan heard of this. So Flatbush is a long way off, and that Sunday he hadn't even a nickel, so he walked. At midnight, John Good went to his room and found him in the usual state. Why did you do it this time, Hannigan? And you straight from seeing the master? Asked John, you know, why are you like this? I mean, you just came from him. He says, that's just it, said Hannigan earnestly. I'm straight from seeing him. Why, John, he's perfection. the light of the world. He is, John. It's too much for a man. It's too discouraging. And that's a word. It's discouraging. The thing is, I mean, all of us can draw to conclusions about the word discouraging. It's, I guess, if somebody sees Abdu'l-Bahá being so kind and generous and luminous and everything you can think of, and he's supposed to be the example for all of us Baha'is, this guy's not a Baha'i. You see that and you figure, how can I live up to, how can I be like him? It's like so hard. Sometimes people think when it's too hard to be that good, might as well be bad. I mean, Jesus, what's the point? Why, if you can't be that good, it's discouraging. So just forget it. Just let go. Forget to pray. Forget to do anything good. Just do whatever. That may not be the point exactly here, but that's what my point. The point is that it's when it's too tough, can be excellent. So, just don't do it. Just be yourself and settle for something less. So that was time. So I just want to connect with Raga.
Oh no.
About Juliet Thompson. So that night, the master had the supper all who had been with him at the mission. It was held in his suite at the Ansonia. I don't know where that hotel is in New York. And he took me and two of the Persians, Waliullah Khan and Ahmad, in his own taxi to the hotel. So he went in a taxi to the hotel of the master. As we drove up Broadway, glittering with its electric signs, he spoke of them smiling, apparently much amused. Then he told us that Baha'u'llah had loved light. I mean, but we don't Baha'u'llah love nature. Now he says Baha'u'llah loved light. He could never get enough light. He taught us, the master said, to economize in everything else, but to use light freely. So that's what you should do if you can afford the bills, of course. It is marvelous, I said, to be driving through all this light by the side of the light of lights. This is nothing, the master answered. This is only the beginning. We will be together in all the worlds of God. You cannot realize here what that means. You cannot imagine it. You can form no conception here in this elemental world of what it is to be with me in the eternal worlds. Now, just think about that. You can form no conception here in this elemental world of what it is to be with me in the eternal worlds. Oh, I cried, with such a future before me, how could my heart cling to any earthly object? The master turned suddenly to me. Will you do this thing? He asked. Will you take your heart from this other and give it wholly to God? Oh, I will try, she said. He laughed heartily at this. First, you say you will, and then that you will try. That is because I have learned my own weakness. What can I do with my heart? And now the master spoke gravely. I am very much pleased with that answer, Juliet. That night, I saw as never before the glory of Abdu'l-Bahá. 9 of us gathered at his table. He sat at the head, Mr. Mills on his left, I on his right. Just above him hung a big round lamp, so that he sat in a pool of strong light while the rest of us were in shadow. In his ivory-colored abba over the long white robe, his white hair spread out upon his shoulders, he was like some massive statue of a deity carved in alabaster. For a while he was silent, and we surrounded him, silent. But after he had served the food, he began to speak. He told us of the play, The Terrible Meek, which he had seen that afternoon. It is based on the crucifixion. Now, it's a bit long, but but I'm going to read it to you anyway. I'm sorry. He just tells the way he thinks it should be. He says, but such a representation should be complete, he said, and taken from its inception to its consummation. It should be an impersonation of the life of Jesus from the beginning to the end. For example, he says, his baptism, the disciples of John the Baptist turning to him, Jesus, the dawn of Christianity, then the Christ in the temple, well portrayed, the meeting of Jesus and Peter on the shore of Tiberias, where Jesus called Peter to follow him, that he might become a fisher of men. The gathering together of the Jews, the accusations against Jesus, for they said, we're expecting certain conditions at the time of the appearance of the Messiah, and unless these conditions are fulfilled, it is impossible to believe. It is written that he will come from an unknown place. Thou art from Nazareth, we know thee and thy people. According to the explicit text of the scriptures, the Messiah is to wield a scepter, a sword. Thou hast not even a staff. The Messiah is to be established on the throne of David, but thou, a throne? Thou hast not so much as a mat. The Messiah is to fulfill the law of Moses, which will be spread throughout the world. Thou hast broken the Mosaic law. The Jews, in the time of the Messiah, are to be the conquerors of the world, and all men will become their subjects. In the cycle of the Messiah, justice is to reign, it will be exercised even in the animal kingdom, so that the wolf and the lamb will quaff water at the same fountain. Eagle and quail will dwell in the same nest. Lion and deer pasture in the same meadow. But see, the oppression and wrong rampant in thy time. The Jews are captives of the Romans. Rome has uprooted our foundations, pillaging and killing us. What manner of justice is this? But His Holiness Jesus answered, these texts are symbolic. They have an inner meaning. I possess sovereignty, but it is not of it is of eternal type. It is not an earthly empire. Mine is divine, heavenly, everlasting. And I conquer not by the sword. My conquests are by love. I have a sword, but it is not of iron. My sword is my tongue, which divides truth and falsehood. Yet they persisted in rejecting him. These are mere interpretations. They said, we will not give up the letter for these. Then they rose against him, accusing and persecuting him, inventing libels according to their superstitions. He is a liar. He is the false Christ. Believe him not. Beware lest ye listen. He will mislead you, will lure you from the religion of your fathers, and will create a turmoil amongst you. Then the scribes and the Pharisees consult together. Let us hold a conclave and conceive a plan. This man is a deceiver. We must do something. What? The master gaily mimicked their confusion. Let us expel him from the country. Let us imprison him, and let us refer the matter to the government. Thus the religion of Moses shall be free of him. After this, the betrayal of Jesus, not by an enemy, not by an outsider, but by one of his disciples, Dr. Farid. I was startled by the sudden peremptory call of that name. By one of his own disciples. Had you been there, Dr. Farid, had you been there, you would have seen that Mary of Magdalene even looked like Juliet. And there is a footnote down at the end of this page. It says, Dr. Farid, within the year, turned traitor, became a covenant breaker. And Abdu'l-Bahá announced it right there as he was telling the story of Jesus. Imagine. We're not going to dwell on Dr. Farid and who he was, but it's like a lot of Baha'is, including Dr. Ahmad Sohrab and others. It's awful. Then, continued the master, the government will summon Jesus and bring him before Pontius Pilate, and these scenes should be fully portrayed. Here I ceased to take notes. I was stabbed to the heart. As he flashed each scene to us with his vivid words and gestures, I felt that he was reliving it. When he came to that walk to Golgotha, Jesus the Savior, stumbling beneath the weight of his cross while the mob capered about, bowing backward, mocking, the King of the Jews, I knew he was telling us of remembered anguish. And when all this is finished, he said, then the terrible meek will be expressed. The last scene centered around the disciples, united now and ablaze with the Pentecostal fire. The master described them surrounded by multitudes, teaching with those tongues of fire that His Holiness Jesus had verily been the King of spirits, His word, the word of God, and His reign in the hearts of men. When the master had ended, We sat so silent that the falling of a rose leaf might have been heard. He broke the silence. The voice of Mary lamenting at the cross today made me think of your voice, Juliet, and Lua Getzinger. And then he smiled at me. Eat, Juliet, he said, for the food on my plate was untouched. In the upper hall, on our way to the master's room suite, we had met the little chambermaid who had told me the day before that she thought him a great saint. In my bag were about 80 quarters left over from the mission, the giving to the Bowery people. So the master asked the girl to hold up her apron, took the bag from me, and emptied the whole of its contents into the apron. Then he walked quickly towards his suite, we following him, all but Mr. Grundy, whom the maid stopped. Oh, see what he has given me, she said. And when Mr. Grundy told her about the mission and the master's kindness to the man there, I will do the same with this money. I will give away every cent of it, she said. Later, when the table was cleared and we were sitting with the master in another room talking of the scene at the mission, someone asked him if charity were advisable. He laughed and still laughing said, assuredly, give to the poor. If you give them only words, when they put their hands into their pockets after you've gone, they will find themselves none the richer for you. Baha'is need to think about that. Sometimes we think we should not give to the poor. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. Well, that's the answer for you. He says, don't give to beggars. It didn't say don't give to the poor. And just at that moment, we heard a light tap at the door. It opened, and there stood the little maid. She came straight towards the master, seeming not to see anyone else, and her eyes were full of tears. I wanted to say goodbye, sir, she said. Master was leaving for Washington the next day, early the next morning, and to thank you for all your goodness to me. I never expected such goodness, and to ask you to pray for me. Her voice broke. She sobbed, hid her face in her apron, and rushed from the room. What an illustration to the master's word, assuredly give to the poor, and how wonderfully timed. So on April 22nd, that's the next entry in the diary. It doesn't correspond to the exact days. It says, oh, those mornings at the Astonia, in the master's white sunny rooms filled with spring flowers and roses. People poured in to see him in droves, sometimes 150 in one morning. He would become exhausted and receive the latest arrivals in bed, sitting in the outer room, though frequently called to him. I would watch them go into his bedroom and come out changed, as though they had had a bath of life, or like candles that had been lighted in that inner chamber. Leonard Abbott came out with flushed cheeks and bright eyes. That beautiful head against the pillow, he said. Charles Rand Kennedy, the playwright, author of The Terrible Meek, said, I was in the presence of God. I myself took Nancy Scholl in. When we left, she whispered to me, I could not have stood the vibrations in there one moment longer. Power encircles that bed. Alas, alas, New York has now lost the great overhanging aura of the master. He is in Washington, but I'm going there tomorrow to stay with my dear Mrs. Elkins. So all this time, Abdu'l-Bahá was in New York. Then she writes, the next entry is May 7th. She says, Washington was beautiful. The banners of the spring floating out everywhere, trees along the street in full leaf, flowering bushes and tulip beds in the parks and in the grass plots in front of houses. The Japanese cherry trees behind the White House, a long row of coral pink clouds. Now remember, we keep saying that Juliet Thompson is a painter. I mean, she did paint the portrait and probably did more more things. But, you know, she writes like a painter. I mean, you know, her descriptions are painter's description. If it weren't for her sense of beauty and color, I don't think we would have gotten all these descriptions of the master. No way. I don't think anybody could, but she did, in words. The day arrived, April 23rd. I met the master at luncheon at the Persian embassy, where Khan is now acting as minister. That's Ali Kuli Khan, who's a Baha'i, the chargé d'affaires for the Persian legation. He is the father of Marcia Gale, as you all know, married to Florence. So, the table was strewn with rose petals, as the master's table always is in Akka, and Persian dishes were served. A colored man, Louis Gregory, you know, came in hand with the cause, was present, and the master gave a wonderful talk on race prejudice, which, however, I will not quote here since it has been kept, meaning it has been published in the Promulgation of Universal Peace. And besides, I'm longing to catch up with these days when I'm feeling with all my capacity for feeling, when the gates of my heart are flung wide open and fire sweeping through, burning up my heart. When I'm seeing through tears the manifest glory of the beloved. I really don't want to write about Washington. This heart was not awakened then. But he said a lovely thing at Khan's table, which I must keep. Mrs. Parsons was at the luncheon. Before she became a Baha'i, she had been a Christian Scientist, and now she brought up the question of mental suggestion as a cure for physical disease. The master replied that some illnesses, such as consumption and insanity, develop from spiritual causes, grief, for example, and that these could be healed by the spirit. But Mrs. Parsons persisted. Extreme physical cases, like broken bones, also be healed by the spirit. A large bowl of salad had been placed before the master, who sat at the head of the table, and Florence Khanum, the wife of Ali Khuli Khan, on his right. If all the spirits in the air, he laughed, were to congregate together, they could not create a salad. Nevertheless, the spirit of man is powerful, for the spirit of man can soar in the firmament of knowledge, can discover realities, can confer life, can receive the divine glad tidings. Is not this greater, and he laughed again, than making a salad? About the broken bones, you know. One more lovely thing. The servants were late bringing in the dessert, and Florence apologized, whereupon little Rahim, which is one of the three children of Ali Khuli Khan, you know, there was Marzieh, Gail, Hamideh, and Rahim. So Rahim, standing beside her, spoke up. Even the king of Persia has to wait, doesn't he, mother? Rahim, dear, explained Florence, Abdu'l-Bahá is king of the whole world. Oh, said Rahim, very much abashed, I forgot. After the luncheon, Florence and Khan held a large reception for which a number of very distinguished people came, among them Dia Pasha, the Turkish minister and his whole family, Duke Lita and his wife, Admiral Perry, and Alexander Graham Bell. Between the end of lunch and this reception, the master went upstairs to rest and to give a few private interviews. When he reappeared among us, the two living rooms were already crowded. He walked quickly to the open folding doors, and standing there at the center with a strikingly free and simple bearing, he immediately began to speak. His words, too, were simple and of a captivating sweetness, a startling clarity. Dia Pasha stood next to me, his eyes riveted on the master. When the master had finished speaking, the old diplomat, who is a fierce Mohammedan, turned to me. This is irrefutable. This is pure logic, he said. A few months before, at the request of his daughter-in-law, an American girl, and a dear friend of mine, I had given Dia Pasha the message. I had to give it in French, as he doesn't understand English, and my French being rusty by now, I'm afraid I didn't do it very well. He looked so skeptical, almost contemptuous, the whole time I was speaking. But when I said that through the Baha'i teachings, I had become a Mohammedan and convinced him of this by the reverent way I spoke of Muhammad, I really touched Dia Pasha. He rose from the table where we were at lunch, left the room and returned with a precious and very old volume of the Quran on illumined parchment and with a hand-tooled cover. No Christian eye has but yours, he said, has ever looked upon this. To return to the Persian embassy, a delicious thing happened when the master greeted Perry, who has just succeeded in publicly disgracing Captain Cook and proven himself, and not Captain Cook, the discoverer of the North Pole. At that moment in the embassy, he looked like a blown up balloon. I was standing beside the master when Khan brought the admiral over and introduced him. The master spoke charmingly to him and congratulated him on his discovery. Then, with the utmost sweetness, added these surprising words. He says, for a very long time, the world had been much concerned about the North Pole, where it was and what was to be found there. Now, he, Admiral Perry, had discovered it and that nothing was to be found there. And so, in forever relieving the public mind, he had rendered a great service. I shall never forget Perry's nonplussed face. The balloon collapsed. Immediately after the Khan's reception, Mrs. Parsons too had a large one for the master, to which Dia Pasha came with him. I saw them, to my great delight, enter the hall together hand in hand. Immediately after, Mrs. Parsons' house has real distinction. It is Georgian in style, and in it is a very long, wide ballroom with, at one end, an unusually high mantel. The mantel, as well as the ceiling and paneled walls, delicately carved with garlands. At the windows, hang with silk curtains, the color of jonquil leaves. Here, after this first reception, the master spoke daily, the afternoon, and the whole fashionable world flocked to hear him. Scientists too, and even politicians came. In front of that mantel, a platform had been placed for the master, and every day it was banked with fresh roses, American beauties. Into this room of conventional elegance, packed with conventional people, imagine the master striding with his free step, walking first to one of the many windows, and while he looked out into the light, talking with his matchless ease to the people, turning from the window, striding back and forth with a step so vibrant, it shook you, piercing our souls with those strange eyes, uplifting them, glory streaming upon them, talking, moving to and fro incessantly, pushing back his turban, revealing that Christ-like forehead, pushing it forward again, almost down to his eyebrows, which gave him a peculiar majesty, charging, filling the room with magnetic currents, with a mysterious energy. Once he burst in a child on his shoulder. For a moment, he held her, caressing her. Then he sat her down among the roses. On Thursday, April 25th, the master dined at the Turkish embassy, and I was privileged to be there. Never have I seen such a beautiful table. Hundreds of roses lay the whole length of it, piled, melting into each other, sweeping up from the head and the foot of the table to a great mound in the center where the master sat faced by Dia Pasha. Florence Khanum and Carrie, Madame Dia Bey, Dia Pasha's daughter-in-law, the American wives of Oriental diplomats were placed on either side of the master, and I sat next to Carrie. There are times when the master looks colossal, when His Holiness shines like the sun. That night, he wore the usual white with a honey-colored abba. Dia Pasha, opposite him, watched him with eyes full of tears. His keen old hawk's face strangely softened. The master gave a great address on the civilizations built on the basic teachings of the prophets. Then he spoke of this dinner as a wonderful occasion. The East and the West, he said, are met in perfect love tonight. There was something so poignant in his words, so flame-creating, that for a moment I was overcome. Later, he spoke of the deep significance of the international marriages represented there. Diabes and Carey's, Ali Khulikan's and Florence's. Carey made me very happy by saying, Juliet told me long ago of your teachings when I was only 15 years old. What fruit that seed had borne sown in a child. Dia Pasha made a thrilling speech, rising and turning a lover's face to the master. He called him the light of the world, the unique one of the age, who had come to spread his glory and perfection amongst us. I am not worthy of this, said the master, very simply. Always a great power is released from the master's divine humility. As I bade Dia Pasha good night, looking at me through a mist of tears, he said, truly, he is a saint. One day, Mrs. Elkins invited the master to drive with us, and we went to the soldier's home. The Elkinses, because of Catherine's engagement to the Duke of Abruzzi, have been terribly hounded by the newspapers, but this happened before the master came. He couldn't have known about it through any outward means. Yet no sooner were we seated in the car than he said to Mrs. Atkins, how the newspapers here persecute you. Come away, smiled the master. Elude these journalists. Come to Haifa, where there's peace. Juliet will tell you there's peace in Haifa. Then he spoke of how much I loved her and of her philanthropic deeds, which he prayed might increase. He captured her hand and kept it in his, while she hastily hid the sweet gesture under her cape. Nothing endures, Mrs. Elkins, he said. Nothing but the love of God endures. Look at these trees in full blossom now. And in words which I will not try to repeat, he described the turning of the seasons, the trees in summer flourishing, green leaves, the inevitable autumn with the leaves lying yellow on the ground. This, he said, is a symbol of human life. Remember Babylon? He drew a vivid picture of an ancient Babylon, its towers, its stupendous art. Then of Babylon today, the waste of rubble, the hyena prowling among the crumbled stones. No other sign of life but the voice of the owl by night, or a lark singing at daybreak. Remember Tyre. Here too was beauty and splendor and pomp. Think of Tyre now. I have been there. I have seen. He spoke of my mother that day. Juliet's mother is very good. Her heart is very pure. As soon as we met, her face became radiant. When we reached home, Mrs. Elkins said to me, you can't hide a thing from him. He sees everything that is in your heart. The day Mrs. Elkins first met the master, she mentioned her husband, the senator, was Senator Stephen Benton Elkins, who had died January 4th, 1911. So she mentioned the master, her husband, the senator, who died about a year ago. I wish he were here now, she said, to meet you. Inshallah, replied the master, for his good deeds, I shall meet him in the kingdom of God. One of the senator's good deeds had been to protect the Baha'is in Akka and Haifa while the master was being tried for his life in 1907. I was so thankful to be in Washington. At those daily meetings in Mrs. Parsons' house, I would see many of my old friends of my childhood. Mrs. Elkins went with me every day to the meetings, sometimes when all the chairs were taken, standing the whole afternoon, although she was far from well. One day, however, she was not with me. That night, she was giving a small dinner at an opera party, and she had to rest for this. So, being free for an hour or so, I decided to stay at Mrs. Parsons and have a little visit with Edna. While Edna and I were talking, the master suddenly entered the room. I'm going out for a drive, he said, but wait until I return. Edna, and you too, Juliet, wait. I will see you in a short time. So I waited and waited. 6:30 came, 7. We were to dine at 7:30, and the Elkins' house was a long way off, rather indirect on the car line. Go, Juliet, said Edna, urged Edna. I will explain to the master. But how could I? My lord had told me to stay. And now I shall have to digress and tell what may seem just at first another story. When I was 10 years old, and I remember the time because that year we were living with my grandmother, a very presumptuous idea took possession of me. I began to dream of someday painting the Christ. I even prayed that I might. Oh God, I would pray, you know, Christ didn't look like a woman the way all the pictures of him look. Please let me paint him when I grow up as the King of Men. And I never lost hope of this until I saw the Master. Then I knew that no one could paint the Christ. Could the sun, with the whole universe full of its radiation or endless flashes of lightning, be captured in paint? Imagine my surprise and dismay, fear and joy and gratitude all mixed together at the news given me by Mrs. Gibbons when the Master came to New York. The night before he landed, she had received a tablet in which he said, on my arrival in America, Miss Juliet Thompson shall paint a wonderful portrait of me. This was in response to a supplication from Mrs. Gibbons asking that her daughter might paint him, which she never did, though the Master graciously gave her permission, even more graciously adding those words about me. So it was a little after 7 when the Master came back from his drive. Entering the room in which he had left me and where, of course, I was still waiting, he said, "Ah, Juliet, for your sake, I returned. Mrs. Hemick wanted to keep me, but I had asked you to wait, therefore I returned." After a pause, he added, "Would you like to come up and paint me tomorrow?" So I learned the reward of obedience, such a reward for so small an act of obedience. Once in Haifa, he said to me, "Keep my words, obey my commands, and you will marvel at the results." Now, let me just interject here by saying that that was said to Juliet Thompson. And one can say that if all of us do the same, maybe we also see marvel at results. And Juliet Thompson is all of us. And by a miracle, I wasn't late for dinner. The dinner, because of another guest, had been postponed a half hour. The next morning, I went very early to Mrs. Parsons' house, taking my box of pastels, but though it was only 8 o'clock, quite a crowd had already gathered, and I felt that the morning was doomed to be a broken one. Not only that, but the light in the rooms upstairs where I was supposed to paint is very weak. The delicate wallpaper with tiny bunches of flowers all over it, I couldn't use it as background for his head. So for a while I was in despair, for I dared not make the suggestion I had in mind, but in the end I did. Begging him to forgive me if I were doing something wrong, I asked if he would pose in New York instead. To this, he consented so freely and sweetly that I had no more qualms about it. It was very daring. Smart woman. The following day, I went to Mrs. Parsons to meet Lee McClung, the Treasurer of the United States. I don't know, these politicians, were coming around. I looked up on Wikipedia, who is this Mr. Klung? He was a young treasurer of the U.S. Secretary, U.S. Treasurer, government. It's a long story about his life and the political problems and whatever happened there in the States at that time. But anyway, so she went to Mrs. Parsons to meet with Lee McClung, the Treasurer of the United States. Lee McClung had been one of the idols of my early adolescence. He had seemed quite old to me then, though now he's only 38. When I saw him again last winter for the first time in about 10 years, he had made all sorts of fun of me for my conversion to Baha'ism. It made me laugh out of one eye and cry out of the other. He said, "What does your mother think about it? Have you converted her?" But at Mrs. Parsons' first meeting, to my great surprise, there he was in the audience. I couldn't wait to speak to him or to present him to the Master, as Mrs. Elkins was in a hurry that day. But in the evening, he dined with us. "How did you feel when you saw the Master?" I asked him. A shy look came into his face, and Mr. McClung is anything but shy. "Well," he said, "I felt as though I were in the presence of one of the great old prophets, Elijah, Isaiah, Moses. No, it was more than that. Christ. Now I have it. He seemed to me my divine Father." Then he said he must leave as a little early as he was going to Mr. Bill's, Alexander Graham Bill's, to meet Abdu'l-Bahá there. Later, I was told that the master had made an address at Mr. Bill's. Then others were called on to speak. But when Lee McClung was called on, he said, after Abdu'l-Bahá has spoken, I cannot. At Mr. McClung's request, I had made an appointment for him with the master for a private interview, and this was the reason I was here to meet at Mrs. Parson. I arrived a little ahead of time, and while I was waiting for Mr. McClung, a door in the hall opened, and there stood the master, beckoning to me. He was alone, so he had to fall back on his English and my scant Persian. How is your mother, he asked first. How old is she? But I couldn't tell him. Mama, having always concealed her age, till I think even she doesn't know it now. About 50? I think so. How old are you? I confessed my age. In my eyes, you're 15, he replied so sweetly. In your eyes, I'm an infant? Yes, baby. Then the translator arrived. Says, tell Juliet, the master began at once, that she teaches well. I have met many people who have been affected by you, Juliet. You're not eloquent, you're not fluent, but your heart teaches. You speak with a feeling, an emotion, which makes people ask, what is this she has? Then they inquire, they seek and find. It is so with Lua. You never find Lua speaking with dry eyes. You will be confirmed. A great bounty will descend upon you. You will become eloquent. Your tongue will be loosed. Teach, always teach. The confirmations of the Holy Spirit descend upon those who teach constantly. Never feel fear. The Holy Spirit will give you the words to say, never fear. You will grow stronger and stronger. That erect head, that hand held high in command, the power that eddied from him as he spoke those words, how can I ever feel fear again when I have to mount the dreaded platform? It was later that he said to me, you have many friends, you have no enemies. Everybody is your friend. Do not think I'm ignorant of conditions in New York. Both factions are pleased with you, Juliet, and have nothing but good to say of you, although they complain of others. Miss X is pleased with you, Mrs. XX is pleased with you, laughing as he mentioned these two chief disturbers of the peace. And you have accomplished this only through your sincerity. Others may do this through diplomatic action, but you have done it with your heart. Footnote, right, I'm destroying my diary in longhand, and I can't bear to lose any of the master's words to me, those dear words of encouragement. That is why I keep them. So, I mean, I don't know what happened to this diary because she threw away stuff and kept stuff. Just then, Lee McClung arrived and the master took him upstairs. Now, there's a footnote down here that Mr. McClung died soon afterwards. Very bizarre. Maybe, I looked it up on Wikipedia, maybe died 2 years later, 1914. Very strange. On Saturday, May 11th, just 1 month from the day of his landing, the master returned to New York from Washington, Cleveland, and Chicago. We're keeping here because she only met him, stayed with him in New York. A few of us gathered in his rooms to prepare them for him and fill them with flowers, then to wait for his arrival. May Maxwell, Lua Getzinger, Carrie Kinney, Kate Ives, Grace Roberts, and I, Mr. Mills and Mr. Woodcock, were waiting too. The master has a new home in the Hudson apartment house. It's now 227 Riverside Drive, overlooking the river. His flat is on one of the top stories so that its windows frame the sky. Now the windows were all open and the fresh breeze blew in. About 5 o'clock, he came on the coming of that presence. If only I could convey to the future the mighty commotion of it. The hearts almost suffocate with joy. The eyes burn with tears at the stir of that step. It is futile to try to express it. Sometimes when the sun breaks through clouds and spreads a great fiery glow, I get something of that feeling. After greeting us all, the master took a seat by the window and began to talk to us with supreme love and gladness, wittily, tenderly, eloquently, carrying us up as if on wings to the apex of sublime feeling, so that we wept, then turning our tears to sudden little ripples of laughter as an unexpected gleam of wit flashed out, then melting our hearts with his yearning affection. He had been horrified in Washington by the prejudice against the Negroes. What does it matter, he asked, if the skin of a man is black, white, yellow, pink, or green? In this respect, the animals show more intelligence than man. Black sheep and white doves and blue do not quarrel because of difference of color. Lua, May, and I, for the first time together, in the glory of his presence, sat on the floor in a corner, gazing through tears at him, and whenever we could wrench out our eyes from the sorrowful beauty of his face, silhouetted against the sky, gazing at one another, still through tears. Day after day, I was with him there. Lou and I had permission to be always with him. I would go to his apartment in the early morning and stay through the whole day, and again, he would call me to his presence. My Lord, I said once, really shouldn't take your time. I don't want to take your time. I'm only too thankful to be here, serving at a distance, somewhere in your atmosphere. I know you're content with whatever I do, therefore, I sent for you, Juliet. He replied. On the 13th of May, Percy Grant's birthday, a meeting of the Peace Conference took place at the Hotel Astor. It was an enormous meeting with thousands present. The master was the guest of honor, and the first speaker, Dr. Grant, and Rabbi Wise, the other speakers. The master sat at the center on the high stage, Dr. Grant on his right, Rabbi Wise on his left. Oh, the symbolism of that, the Jewish rabbi, the Christian clergyman with the center of the covenant between on the platform of the World Peace Conference. The master was really too ill to have gone to this conference. He had been in bed all morning, suffering from complete exhaustion and had a high temperature. I was with him all morning. While I was sitting beside him, I asked, must you go to the Hotel Astor when you are so ill? I work by the confirmation of the Holy Spirit, he answered. I do not work by hygienic laws. If I did, he laughed, I would get nothing done. After that meeting, the wonderful record of which has been kept, the master shook hands with the whole audience, with every one of those thousands of people. I cannot believe that. How can masters do that? But he did. On Friday, the 14th of May, I had quite a distinguished visitor, Khan Bahadur Allah Bakhsh, the governor of Lahore. So Barakullah had sent him to see me. I invited him to my meeting that night, and he came and seemed to fall in love with the teachings. The next morning, early, he called on the master at the Hudson apartment house. Lua, May, and I were there at the time, and I told him that May was one of my spiritual mothers, and Lua Getzinger, my spiritual grandmother. Whereupon the old gentleman said that in that case, I was his mother, May Maxwell, his grandmother, and Lua, his great-grandmother. Very soon the master sent for him, and kept him a long time in his room. When the interview was over and Khan Bahadur Allah Bakhash had left, the master called me to him. Very soon the master sent for him. Sorry. You teach well, Juliet, he said. You teach with ecstasy. You ignite the souls. A great bounty will descend upon you. I have perfect confidence in you as a teacher. Your heart is pure, absolutely pure. My heart, absolutely pure. I wept. Then for the second time, the master gave me a picture of himself. 3 days later, I had a note from the governor of Lahore. In it, he said, Abdu'l-Bahá is the divine light of today. One night, I took Marjorie to the master. She had in her hand an offering of tulips, grown in her own garden, and these he distributed among his visitors. Juliet's love for you is divine, he said, speaking to Marjorie, and your love for each other must become so great that no stab will affect it. Then he told us that in reality our friendship was an eternal one. Marion Decay went with me to him. Your friend, Juliet? Ancient friend? And he smiled at the child. You must become a flame of love. Like Juliet, he said, I have to keep all his sweet words to me. You must become as steadfast as a rock, firm, strong, so that when the storms break over you, when the thunder roars and the winds rage, you will not be shaken. You must become a teacher, a speaker. On the 15th of May, the master went away for a few days. As soon as he returned, Lua telephoned me. The master says, come up now if you wish. If not, you have permission to come to him at any time and to stay as long as you're able. Only don't displease your mother. He wants her to be happy. He says, this is his message, Julie. So on Sunday, May 19th, he spoke at the church of the Divine Fraternity. This was unbearably beautiful. The church is Byzantine, making me think of the worship of the early Christians. The interior is of gray stone. Oh, the look of his that day. Then more vividly than ever he shone as a good shepherd. Returned at last to his flocks, I wept through the whole service. At the end of the pew in front of me sat Lua, her eyes fixed on the master, rapt, adoring, her beauty immeasurably heightened by that recognition, that adoration. Soon I caught a glimpse of another rapt face, a man's, my old friend, Mr. Bailey. Mr. Bailey is the last person I could have hoped to see there. A very old gentleman, he had always seemed to me a hopelessly unconvertible atheist. At least he would never listen to a word from me about the cause. And now here he sat, and never have I seen a face more touched. On May 21st, Mrs. Tatum, will explain, she explains who Mrs. Tatum is. At the reception for the master, the people who were there were of the fashionable world with a sprinkling of artists and writers. Mrs. Sheridan was pouring tea. Now, who is this Mrs. In December of that same year, Mrs. Tatum came to see me. The master, she told me, said such a strange thing to me just before he left America. I had been saying how sorry I was that I had left my car in Boston and couldn't put it at his disposal as I had done the last spring. He answered, soon, Mrs. Tatum, you will not need your car, for you will be riding in a chariot of fire. I wonder, Juliet, what he meant by that. Within a few weeks, dear Mrs. Tatum died suddenly. So that was in December of that year after the master left. So anyway, this was May, so this is a few months before. Mrs. Tatum's house was beautiful, is beautiful. The impression you get is of space and light. The wide staircase winds up through a very wide hall, from which one on each side, rooms open, living rooms, dining room, library, all these were soon crowded. The first friend I caught sight of was Louis Potter. Louis Potter is, we don't know who he is, he's one of the best known sculptors in this country. Also died in 1912, in August, very tragically. Even after seeing the master and really loving him, he was still seeking truth in other directions. He went out to California to follow a spiritual quack whose methods of healing killed poor Louis. The last thing from his gifted hand was beautiful metal with the master's profile on it. So he came running up to me, exclaiming, "Oh, August Juliet," and attached himself at once to Lua and me. Suddenly, there was a stir among the people, and Abdu'l-Bahá was in our midst. He walked over to a yellow couch which curved along the big half moon of the bay window and sat down on it. I think I must tell you how he looked there. Most people writing would not do this. See, that's the whole thing with Juliet. I think I must tell you how. He looked there. He looked there. His surroundings were all white and yellow. Sunlight streamed in. The shadows on his face were transparent. His profile against the blue sky through the polished glass of the window pane outlined in light. "Come, Louis," I said to Louis Potter, "let's go to the master." Louis had never seen him before, but he skipped forward like a buoyant fawn. His head tipped on one side, his hand outstretched. "Ah," he said. It was a little cry from his soul, as though he were just coming home and was so glad. And the master too, his arms wide open, welcoming Louis home. Percy Grant arrived as soon as he appeared, big and imposing in the room. The master rose almost eagerly, smiling and holding out his hand. "Ah, Dr. Grant," he said. They stood for what seemed to be minutes, their hands clasped. Percy, with beautiful deference, bowing his head, a gentle, almost tender look on his face. One of the Persians translated the master's greeting to him, but spoke so low that I could not catch the words. Then Percy sat down on the curving window seat so that he faced the master. Soon there was another stir in the room. A small, rather plain, middle-aged woman with the most astonishing eyes, very clear, very violet, stood in the doorway, almost timidly, and the master at once sent Dr. Farid to her to ask her to come in and sit by him. This was Sarah Graham Mulhall. He spoke a few words to her, and she rose and went out, returning after some time with a tray and a pot of tea and 2 cups on it. The tray was placed on a stool between the master and Miss Mulhall, and they drank their tea together. Footnote. This is a big footnote here. I don't know how this footnote is. She says, this is in 1947, she writes, Miss Mulhall's father and brother, who were physicians, had come to New York from England to study the effects of drugs on the body and mind. Both died mysteriously. Miss Mulhall's only training had been in music. She was a very gentle, retiring woman and knew nothing of the ways of business or organization or medicine or anything that would have equipped her for the evidently dangerous work of her father and brother. But something inside her against which she fought urged her to continue it. She was in the midst of this inward conflict when Mrs. Tatum telephoned her and asked her to come to meet the master. At first, Miss Mulhall declined, saying that she really couldn't go anywhere. She was too absorbed in her own problems. She couldn't face a crowd of people. But later she thought, perhaps Abdu'l-Bahá is a prophet, as Mrs. Tatum believes, and he might help me in making my decision. Now, there's another note down at the bottom of the page. She says, Baha'is do not believe that Abdu'l-Bahá is a prophet of God, although this was a widespread notion at the time. The prophets of Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah and Baha'u'llah. Anyway, so people, this is how people thought way back when. So the master, when he called her to him in Mrs. Tatum's house, asked if she would do something for him. Would she brew some tea for him with her own hands and drink it with him? And while they drank the tea and talked, he himself brought up the problem. He told her she must do the work she had in mind. She would rise very high in it and become a great counselor. God would always protect her, and all the celestial beings of the Supreme Concourse would rally to her assistance. It's nice to hear those words. That's what he told her. She did become a great counselor. After years of wonderful work, Governor Al Smith, made her advisor and first commissioner of narcotics for New York State. One night, she herself led a raid against one of the chief centers of the drug ring, a ring of very rich, prominent men, some of them pillars of St. Patrick's, some pillars of St. John's Cathedral. Rounding them up in their center, an apartment on Park Avenue, she, with the help of her squad of police, locked them in, then telephoned to the governor. He took the next train to New York and upheld Miss Mulhall's determination to bring them all to trial. Then he went to Cardinal Hayes and Bishop Manning. Cardinal Hayes said, "These men are the worst type of criminals. I agree with you that they must be punished." Bishop Manning said, "You can't touch my parishioners. They are the builders of St. John's Cathedral." He threatened Miss Mulhall, "If you ruin them, I will destroy your office," which he did. Ultimately, for of course, every one of the men was found guilty and sent to Fort Leavenworth. After Lemons was elected governor, the Narcotics Commission was abolished. But in the meantime, Miss Mulhall had done a tremendous work. Her book, Opium, the Demon Flower, has become world famous. All right, so if you have time, we can pick up Opium, the Demon Flower. So that's the end of this footnote. Then I caught sight of little Fergie. His real name I don't want to mention because of what I'm going to tell. He is a noted newspaperman who writes visionary books on economics. Percy Grant calls him my prophet. His face is pale and pinched and suffering, and he wears a thick chestnut wig. I went up to him and asked, "Wouldn't you like to meet the master?" "I think not," he drawled. "I really have nothing to say to him." And now the master began to speak to the whole room full of people. He was very happy, he said, to be with us. Think of the contrast. For years he had been imprisoned in a fortress, his associates criminals. Now he found himself in spacious homes, associating, he said, with you. His talk gradually shaped itself to some definite point, which, however, he kept to the very end. I wondered what could be coming. When he came, it was like a thunderclap. Think of it, he said. 2 kings were dethroned in order that I might be freed. This is naught but pure destiny. I glanced at Percy Grant and saw that he was deeply stirred. He had been listening, still with that tender deference, his head slightly tipped to one side. But at these last startling words of the master's, in a flash, the placidity of his face broke up, something burned through, and his eyes sparkled. And now, under the master, suddenly rising to his feet, strong and incredibly majestic, "You here in America must work with me for the peace of the world and the oneness of mankind." And with this, he left us, the room seeming strangely empty after he had gone. "You here in America must work with me for the peace of the world and the oneness of mankind." The next morning, early, Howard McNutt came to see me looking so radiant that I knew he was bringing good news. Then he told me he just had breakfast with Dr. Grant and the master was to speak again at the Church of the Ascension at the People's Forum, this time the night of June 2nd. Bishop Birch had severely reprimanded Percy for inviting the master to speak on April 14th and seating him in the bishop's chair. But an antic thing like that would never stop Percy Grant, only make him more defiant. He had talked very freely with Mr. McNutt about Abdu'l-Bahá and his address on the day before with his great climax. As I listened, he said, I realized profoundly that this was a historic moment, that before me sat one who, imprisoned for the sake of humankind, had been freed by the power of God alone, though through the dethroning of 2 kings. Okay. I don't want to stop now because I want to get to a point. And of course, if I don't finish this, you're going to have to stick with me if you're courageous enough next Sunday in Paris. But I will continue for a few minutes if you don't mind. On May 22nd, the master left for Boston, returning the 26th. After his return, he stayed with the Kinneys a day or so till he moved to his new house. And then came my test. For 2 days, he never even looked at me. My heart bled and burned. I could not endure the withdrawal of his nearness. The 3rd day, I went to the new house, 309 West 78th Street, and there in Lua's arms, I sobbed my heart out. I cry, I said, only because I love him, which I fear was not exactly true, because I have just realized how terrifically I love him. This love burns my heart. It is beyond endurance. Then he sent for me to come to him. With tears rolling down my cheeks, I entered his presence. He was sitting on a couch, writing, and did not look up, still didn't look at me. But at last he said, going straight to the point, piercing to the real cause of my trouble. I have not seen you lately, Juliet, because of the multitude of the affairs, but I have not forgotten my promise to pose for you. Come on Saturday with your materials and I will sit. I thanked him, then falling on my knees, begged him not to banish me from his presence. I could not endure to be separated from him. I loved him. He rose, stood above me, took my hand and held it a long, long time. I still knelt at his feet, let the hem of his garment pressed to my lips. Lua joined her sweet voice to mine. Juliet has had so much trouble this year. She wants to stay close to you now so that her heart may be healed. I want to stay close because I love you. He smiled and said something about another love. That is gone, gone, I cried. At these words of mine, which I thought were true, the strangest thing happened. Always when the master holds my hand, I feel a flow of sparks from his palm to mine. Now this current of life was suddenly cut off. Could I have lied to my Lord? And so, by unconscious self-deception, disconnected myself with the fountainhead of pure truth? But his answer was merciful, reminding me of past sincerities. I am pleased with you, Juliet. You are so truthful. You tell me everything, she said. He turned, laughing to Lua. This is my heart. What can I do with it? I laughed too, through my tears, but soon I began to cry again. He went back to the couch and sat down, and Lua and I followed him and knelt together at his feet there. Don't cry. I wish the whole world could hear the master say, don't cry. Tears would soon cease to be. Don't cry. And happiness and the love of Baha'u'llah cannot exist in the same heart. For the love of Baha'u'llah is happiness. I cry for love of you, my Lord. My tears come from my heart. I can't help it. Your eyes and Lua's, he laughed again, are two rivers of tears. I love Juliet, he added, for her truthfulness. I told Juliet, said Lua, putting her arms around me, as we still knelt together side by side, of your words to Mrs. Kaufman, that these human loves were like waves of the sea rolling to the shore, one behind the other, each wave receding. Vale, said the master. Yes, this is true. You will not find faithfulness in humanity. All humanity is unfaithful. Only God is faithful. Baha'u'llah spent 50 years in prison for the sake of humanity. There was faithfulness. From this moment, cried Lua, Juliet and I dedicate our lives to thee, and we beg to at last die in thy path, to drink the cup of martyrdom. Oh, it would be so good for the cause if two Americans could do this. Take hold of his coat, Julie, and beseech. I touched the hem of his garment. Say yes, implored Lua. Oh, Julie, beg him to say yes. But in Tonon, I had told the master that I would not ask for that cup again, but would wait till God found me ready for it. I accept the dedication of your lives now. The rest will be decided later. And it was clear what he meant, how we must amuse him. I must go back a little on Sunday, May 26th, the night of the master's return from Boston. He spoke at Mr. Ramsdale's church. It's called Mount Morris Baptist Church. My friend Lawrence White, who lives in Utica, had come to New York to meet the master, and he, Sylvia Garnett, and I went together to the church. We entered to see a breathtaking picture. That church suggests an old Jewish synagogue. Behind the chancel is a sweeping arch from which hangs a dark, massive curtain in folds straight as organ pipes. The chancel was empty that night except for the master, sitting almost lying in a semicircular chair, his head thrown back, his luminous eyes uprolled. The sleeves of his bronze-colored abba branched out from his shoulders like great spread wings, hiding his hands so that I was conscious only of his head and those terribly alive eyes. There was an awful mystery about the dominance of the head. It seemed to obliterate the human form and reveal him as the face of God. The curtain behind him might have concealed the Ark of the Covenant, which he, the covenant, was guarding. Later, when he rose to speak, the manifestation of the glory was entirely different. He diffused a softer radiance. Look at him and see the Christ, whispered Lawrence White. Next, he spoke at the church of the Operador. Again, the shepherd. Again, I watched him through blinding tears. Susie. On the 2nd of June, he spoke for Dr. Grant's forum. And there he was simpler. He manifested less, or perhaps I should say, manifested something different, a sort of brotherhood to the masses, still retaining his grandeur. And now he addressed himself to that meeting and to the heart of Percy Grant. The subject was, what can the Orient bring to the Occident? That subject in that church. Lou and I were in front pew with Waliullah Khan and Mirza Mahmud. Suddenly, I was petrified to see Mason Remy coming in through the door of the vestry room. When he was last in the Church of the Ascension, I was sitting beside him, engaged to him, while Percy thundered at me from the pulpit. The text of that sermon that Sunday was the same as the text today. What can the Orient bring to the Occident? Nothing but disease and death, said Percy, his eyes on me. And God wants us to live. He wants us to live. But the speaker this time was the master. He said, the Orient brings to the Occident the manifestations of God. Then he defined the church as that collective center which, attracting many diverse elements, united them into one ordered system, adding that the church was but a reflection of the real collective center, the shepherd, who, whenever his sheep became scattered, reappeared to unite them. So the church, established by God's manifestation, was the law of God. And when Christ said to Peter, on thee I will build my church, he meant he would build his law upon Peter. Upon him, Christ built the law of God, by which all the peoples and creeds were afterward united. The Master has said it again to Percy Grant, be thou like Peter, for this was his message sent by me last summer. When at the end of the marvelous address, Percy stepped out into the chancel, it was absolutely another man I saw, a man touched by the hand of God, shaken to the very roots of his being. As Marjorie said, he looked ill and strangely upset. He could scarcely articulate. The question followed. It is the custom of the forum to ask questions in the center of the chancels, said the master. Dr. Grant on his right, in a choir stall, Dr. Farid behind him. How at home the master looked there. He pushed back his turban and smiled as he answered, often very wittily. Once he raised one finger high. I caught my breath then. He was like Jesus in the synagogue, confronting the scribes and Pharisees, except that his audience were in Pharisees. Okay, you guys. So, what time is it? I think we've spoken for an hour and a half, right, Juliet? Is that correct? What time is it? Yeah. The part I really wanted to read, I'm going to have to keep.
No?
No. I can't. I'm going to have to save it for